The winter of 1978 settled over Moscow like a frozen shroud, the kind of cold that seeped through concrete walls and into the marrow of bones. In the silent corridors of the KGB's second chief director headquarters on Lubyanka Square, Major Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov walked with the measured confidence of a man who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom built on secrets. His promotion had come through that morning, a directive signed by Deputy Chairman Vladimir Kryukov himself. Volkov would now head a counterintelligence subdivision tasked with rooting out Western penetration agents within the Soviet diplomatic corps. It was a position that meant access to classified files spanning decades, surveillance transcripts that could destroy careers with a single line, and the kind of bureaucratic power that made lesser men tremble. At 42, Viktor Volkov embodied the ideal Soviet intelligence officer. His face was unremarkable, the sort that disappeared in crowds, essential for field work. His gray eyes revealed nothing. He spoke 4 languages fluently, had served in East Berlin during construction of the wall, and had personally supervised the interrogation of 3 suspected CIA assets, 2 of whom had confessed before being shipped to labor camps in the Urals. But what made Volkov truly valuable to the organization wasn't just his operational skill. It was his wife. Katia Volkova, née Sokolova, was 36 years old, the daughter of a decorated Red Army colonel who had died defending Stalingrad. She had met Viktor at a mandatory Komsomol gathering in 1965, where young professionals were encouraged to forge connections that would serve the party for life. Their courtship had been brief, efficient, and entirely appropriate. They married 3 months later in a civil ceremony attended by his KGB supervisor and her mother, who wept quietly throughout. For 13 years, Katia had been the model officer's wife. She worked as a translator at the Institute of Foreign Languages, a position that required moderate clearance and absolute discretion. She attended the wives' committee meetings at the KGB Social Club, where women discussed childcare and furniture shortages, while never mentioning what their husbands actually did. She volunteered at the local school, teaching children patriotic songs. She never asked questions. Their apartment on Kutuzovsky Prospect was modest but respectable, 3 rooms in a building reserved for mid-level intelligence personnel. The walls were decorated with bland socialist realist prints. The bookshelf contained approved literature, Sholokhov, Gorky, technical manuals on linguistics. A photograph of Lenin watched from above the radio. Everything in its place. Nothing that could raise an eyebrow during the random apartment inspections that every KGB family understood were part of life. On the evening of November 3rd, 1978, 3 days after Viktor's promotion became official, he returned home at 1947, exactly 17 minutes later than his usual schedule. Katia had dinner waiting. Borscht, black bread, pickled vegetables, and a small piece of beef that had required standing in line for 40 minutes that afternoon. "Congratulations again, Vitya," she said, using the diminutive form of his name that only she was permitted. Her voice carried the practiced warmth of a woman who had learned to perform affection like a state duty. "They're recognizing your worth finally." Viktor hung his coat carefully, checking the pockets out of habit. "It's a significant responsibility. The enemies of the state are becoming more sophisticated. The Americans are recruiting at universities now, using cultural exchanges as cover. We must be vigilant." "Of course," Katia replied, ladling soup into bowls. "Will the new position require more travel?" "Possibly. There are suspected networks in Leningrad and Kiev. I may need to coordinate field operations." He sat down, waiting for her to serve him first, as was proper. "You'll need to maintain the household routines precisely. Any deviation could be noticed. You understand this?" "I understand," she said softly. They ate in near silence, the radio broadcasting news of increased wheat production in Kazakhstan and the ongoing Afghan friendship mission. Viktor occasionally glanced at his wife across the small table. She was still attractive in that severe, disciplined way that Soviet life demanded. Her dark hair was pulled back efficiently. She wore no makeup. Vanity was suspect. Her hands, pale and slender, moved with practiced economy as she ate. After dinner, Viktor retreated to the small second room he used as a study. Katia washed the dishes, listening to the muffled sounds of file folders being opened, Papers rustled. A telephone call made in the clipped jargon of intelligence work. This was their life. This was normal. At 22:30, she knocked gently on the study door. "I'm going to bed. Vitya. Don't work too late." "Soon," he replied without looking up from surveillance transcript marked "Eyes Only, Directorate Use." Katia changed into her nightgown in the darkness of their bedroom, slipping between cold sheets that smelled faintly of Soviet laundry soap. Through the thin walls, she could hear the Petrovs arguing next door, a common occurrence that no one mentioned. In a building full of intelligence officers, everyone pretended not to hear anything. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the street lamps created patterns that never quite resolved into recognizable shapes. Her breathing was controlled, measured. Her hands rested at her sides, unmoving. At some point, Victor came to bed. He didn't wake her, or perhaps he knew she wasn't really sleeping. In the morning, everything would continue as it always had. The perfect Soviet marriage. The perfect Soviet wife. Except that in 72 hours, Katia Volkova would vanish completely, leaving behind only questions that would haunt the KGB for years and expose fractures in the organization's certainty that loyalty could be manufactured through surveillance and fear. But on this night, November 3rd, 1978, she was still there, still performing the role that had been assigned to her since childhood, still breathing quietly in the darkness, still counting the hours until something inside her finally broke free from the ice. The first indication that something was wrong came at 8:43 on Monday morning, when Katia failed to arrive at the Institute of Foreign Languages for her scheduled translation session. Her supervisor, Elena Dmitrievna Klebnikova, a woman whose loyalty to protocol exceeded any human concern, waited exactly 7 minutes before making a telephone call. The call went to the Institute security liaison, who in turn contacted the second chief directorate's personnel monitoring section, which maintained files on all family members of active officers. By 9:15, a low-level functionary named Grigory was dispatching a team to the Volkov apartment to investigate the absence. Victor had left for Lubyanka at 7:30 that morning, as he did every Monday. The apartment had been locked, everything apparently normal. Katia had been asleep, or appeared to be, when he dressed quietly in the dawn darkness. He'd seen her shape beneath the blankets, heard what he assumed was her breathing. He hadn't bothered to wake her. Why would he? When the two-man team arrived at the apartment building, they were met by the building superintendent, a bitter woman named Antonova, who supplemented her meager salary by reporting unusual activities to the local KGB office. She had seen nothing abnormal, she insisted, wringing her weathered hands. The Volkovs were model tenants. Quiet, proper. The apartment door was locked. Antonova produced her master key with trembling efficiency. Inside, everything was precisely as it should be, which was itself the first real sign of trouble. The bed was made with military precision. The kitchen was spotless. The teacup Katia always used for morning tea sat clean and dry in the cupboard. Her work identification card lay on the small table by the door, where she kept it every night. Her winter coat hung in the closet. Her boots were lined up neatly beneath it. But Katia was gone. The team leader, a methodical man named Sokolov who had investigated 36 disappearances during his career, began a systematic search. In the bedroom, Katia's clothes remained folded in the wardrobe. 3 dresses, 2 skirts for blouses, all in approved gray or brown tones. Her undergarments were accounted for. Her single pair of good shoes sat undisturbed. Check the documents, Sokolov ordered his partner. The internal passport every Soviet citizen was required to carry, gone. The small amount of money Katia kept in an envelope in the kitchen drawer, gone. Her Communist Party membership card, gone. But more telling than what was missing was what remained. A half-finished letter to her mother lay on Victor's desk, dated November 4th. It discussed nothing remarkable. The weather, difficulties obtaining fresh vegetables, a request for her mother's recipe for pelmeni dumplings. It ended mid-sentence, as if Katia had been interrupted. In the bathroom, investigators found her toothbrush, her modest collection of soap and shampoo, her hairbrush with several dark strands still caught in the bristles. In the kitchen, They discovered that she had apparently prepared tea the previous evening. The pot still contained dried leaves, and a single glass showed the ring mark of having held liquid that had since evaporated. By 11 o'clock, Viktor Volkov had been summoned from his new office. He arrived at the apartment to find it crawling with investigators, his private space now a crime scene or investigation site. The distinction wasn't yet clear. "When did you last see your wife?" Sokolov asked, his tone professional but carrying an edge of accusation. That was standard procedure. In the Soviet system, everyone was suspect until proven otherwise, and a disappearing wife reflected poorly on a counterintelligence officer. "This morning, 7:30, she was asleep," Victor replied, his voice steady despite the flutter of panic beginning in his chest. Not for Katya, not yet, but for what this meant for his career, his access, his position. Did she seem distressed? Unusual in any way recently? Victor considered carefully. Every word would be transcribed, analyzed, used to construct a narrative. She was perfectly normal. Dutiful. We had dinner Saturday evening after my promotion was announced. She congratulated me. We discussed household matters. Nothing unusual. Did she have friends? People she confided in? She had acquaintances from work. The Wives Committee. No close friendships. Victor paused, then added what he knew was required. She understood that excessive social connections were inappropriate for someone in our position. Over the next 6 hours, investigators conducted what the KGB termed a complete background examination. They interviewed Katya's colleagues at the Institute, who described her as competent but reserved. They spoke to the Wives Committee members, who noted she had attended meetings regularly but volunteered little personal information. They questioned the building superintendent again, who swore she had seen Katya return from shopping on Saturday afternoon, carrying the usual string bag of vegetables. But no one had seen her leave. The Petrovs next door, interviewed separately, claimed to have heard nothing unusual. The couple on the floor above, a foreign ministry attaché and his wife, said the same. Everyone had heard nothing, seen nothing, knew nothing. The default Soviet response to any official inquiry. By evening, the investigation had generated its first theory, whispered in careful bureaucratic language: voluntary departure. The implications were devastating. A KGB officer's wife did not simply leave. If she had defected, if she had somehow made contact with Western intelligence, it meant Victor's entire career had been built on a foundation of compromise. It meant he might have been sleeping beside an enemy agent. It meant his promotion had elevated a security risk to a position with access to the most sensitive counterintelligence operations in the Soviet Union. Colonel Anatoly Petrov, Victor's direct superior, summoned him to Lubyanka at 2100 hours that night. The meeting took place in a windowless room on the 3rd floor, where countless others had sat while their lives were dissected. Viktor Sergeyevich. Petrov began, using the formal patronymic that signaled this was official business. "You understand the gravity of the situation. Your wife has disappeared without explanation, taking only her identity documents and a small amount of money. She left behind everything else. This suggests planning, premeditation." Victor sat rigid in the hard chair, his hands flat on his thighs. "I cannot explain it, Comrade Colonel." She gave no indication. Her behavior was entirely normal. "Was your marriage satisfactory? Any conflicts we should know about?" "It was acceptable. We fulfilled our duties to each other and to the state." Petrov studied him for a long moment. "You will be placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's conclusion. Your security clearance is temporarily suspended. You will submit to polygraph examination and provide a complete account of your wife's activities, contacts, and behavior for the past 12 months. You will surrender all classified materials currently in your possession. Do you understand?" "I understand," Victor replied, and in that moment he felt something he hadn't experienced since his first field operation in East Berlin. Genuine fear. Not for Katya, wherever she had gone, whatever she had done, but for himself, for the careful edifice of his career now crumbling around him. That night, alone in the apartment that suddenly felt cavernous and strange, Victor sat at his desk and tried to reconstruct his wife's life, her thoughts, her secrets. But he realized with growing horror that after 13 years of marriage, he knew almost nothing about Katya beyond her surface. The performed role she played so perfectly that he had never thought to look beneath it. Somewhere in Moscow, in the vast apparatus of the KGB, alarm bells were beginning to sound. A loyal wife had vanished, and in an organization built on paranoia and control, nothing was more dangerous than a question without an answer. The initial investigation operated on a fundamental assumption. Katia Volkova had defected to the West, likely with CIA assistance. This theory drove the KGB's response with the inevitability of a freight train on fixed tracks. Colonel Petrov assembled a task force of 12 officers, each assigned to examine a different aspect of Katia's life, looking for the telltale signs of foreign recruitment that they believed must be there. But the deeper they dug, the less sense the evidence made. Senior investigator Yevgeny Arkadyevich Mironov took charge of analyzing Katia's movements over the previous 6 months. A gray-haired veteran who had hunted dissidents since the Khrushchev era, Mironov approached the task with methodical precision. He reconstructed Katia's daily routine using informant reports, surveillance logs that existed for all KGB family members, and interviews with everyone who had encountered her. What emerged was a life of suffocating regularity. Every Monday and Wednesday, Katia walked 17 minutes from the apartment to the institute, arriving between 8:35 and 8:42. She worked until 1,700 hours, translating technical documents from English and French into Russian, aerospace manuals, agriculture reports, nothing classified. She ate lunch in the institute cafeteria, usually alone with a book. She spoke cordially but briefly with colleagues. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she had no work obligations. Surveillance logs showed her shopping at the state stores, standing in lines like every other Soviet housewife, her string bag growing gradually heavier as she moved from vegetables to bread to whatever meat was available. She occasionally visited the library, checking out approved literature, Tolstoy, Chekhov, English-language textbooks for her work. Friday afternoons, she attended the KGB Wives Committee meetings. 12 women gathered in a sparse room at the social club, ostensibly to discuss community matters, but actually to maintain surveillance on each other. The committee's recording secretary, a woman named Ludmila, whose husband worked in the 5th Directorate, had kept meticulous notes. Mironov reviewed months of meeting minutes, looking for anomalies. Katia had spoken rarely, volunteered for appropriate activities, a charity drive for orphans, assistance with the May Day celebrations, but formed no close bonds. She had been present, correct, and entirely unremarkable. She was like a ghost, Ludmila said during her interview, her voice dropping to a whisper despite being in a KGB interrogation room where privacy was impossible. She participated, but she never, I don't know how to explain it. She never seemed to actually be there, like part of her was always somewhere else. Meanwhile, Captain Dmitry Sokolov was investigating Katia's background with forensic intensity. He traveled to Volgograd, where Katia had grown up in the shadow of her father's war hero status. He interviewed her aging mother, Vera Petrovna Sokolova, in her cramped apartment filled with photographs of her dead husband in his Red Army uniform. Katia was always a serious child, Vera told him, her hands shaking as she poured weak tea. After her father died, she was only 6. She became very quiet. She studied hard. She never caused trouble. When she went to Moscow for university, I was proud. When she married Viktor Sergeyevich, I thought she would be safe, protected. Has something happened to her? Sokolov evaded the question, but he noted something in the old woman's tone. Not quite fear, but perhaps something like resignation, as if she had always expected her daughter to disappear somehow. School records from Volgograd showed a student who excelled academically, but participated minimally in social activities. Teacher described her as conscientious and reserved. She had joined the Komsomol at the appropriate age, participated in required activities, and expressed all the correct political sentiments. But one notation from her 8th-year teacher caught Sokolov's attention. Katia completes all assignments to exact specifications, but shows no personal initiative or enthusiasm. Adequate, but not exemplary. At Moscow State University, where Katia had studied linguistics from 1960 to 1965, the pattern continued. Excellent grades. No disciplinary issues. No close friends. She had shared a dormitory room with 3 other women. Sokolov tracked down 2 of them. Both remembered Katia vaguely, the quiet one who studied late into the night and never talked about herself. The third roommate, however, had emigrated to Israel in 1972, which triggered immediate suspicion. Could this connection have been the seed of recruitment? But investigation revealed the woman had had no contact with Katia since graduation, and Israeli intelligence reported she worked as a schoolteacher in Haifa with no intelligence connections. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came from an unexpected source. The KGB's second department, which handled counterintelligence against foreign diplomatic missions, routinely photographed people near Western embassies. On November 8th, while reviewing archive surveillance photos from the past year, a young analyst named Svetlana noticed something. In 3 separate photographs taken over 6 months, April, July, and September 1978, a woman matching Katia's description appeared in the background near the British Embassy compound. In each image, she was on the opposite side of the street, apparently walking past. In none of the photos was she doing anything overtly suspicious, but her presence, 3 times in 6 months near a high-security target, was statistically improbable for someone with no legitimate business in that area. Colonel Petrov ordered an immediate deep investigation. Teams reviewed every surveillance record from the British Embassy for the entire year. They found Katia in 7 additional photographs, always distant, always seemingly coincidental. She was conducting surveillance detection runs. Mironov concluded during a briefing on November 15th. Classic tradecraft. She was checking if she was being followed before making contact. This confirms foreign intelligence recruitment. But one detail troubled Mironov, though he didn't voice it in the meeting. In every photograph, Katia's body language showed no signs of operational awareness. She didn't glance around, didn't pause at shop windows to check reflections, didn't employ any of the standard counter-surveillance techniques. She simply walked past, her expression neutral, her pace steady. Victor, meanwhile, was being subjected to the full apparatus of KGB investigation. On November 10th, he underwent a 6-hour polygraph examination administered by the organization's most experienced operator, Major Konstantin Volkov. No relation, though the shared surname was noted as either coincidence or cruel irony. The examination covered everything: his relationship with Katia, his knowledge of her activities, any unusual behavior, financial irregularities, contact with foreigners. Victor answered each question in the same flat monotone, his physiological responses showing stress, but no clear deception. "Tell me about your intimate relationship with your wife," the examiner asked, watching the needle traces carefully. "We fulfilled our marital obligations," Victor replied. "Approximately twice per month, usually on Saturday evenings." It was satisfactory. Did she ever say anything unusual during intimate moments? Any names? Any hints about other loyalties? She rarely spoke. Neither of us did. It was a private matter conducted privately. The polygraph showed truth. Victor genuinely knew nothing about any hidden life his wife might have led. He had lived beside her for 13 years and remained essentially a stranger to her inner world. In the apartment, forensic specialists conducted what they called a complete materials examination, essentially tearing apart every object looking for hidden messages, codes, or evidence of espionage. They found nothing. No microdots, no invisible ink, no hidden compartments. The books were simply books. The furniture held no secrets. But they did find one item that sparked fierce debate. Hidden beneath the false bottom of Katia's underwear drawer, a location so cliché that almost seemed deliberate, was a small notebook, its pages filled with handwritten text in Russian. Mironov read it late into the night of November 17th, expecting to find coded communications or intelligence notes. Instead, he found something far more unsettling: fragment of personal writing, undated, scattered across the pages like shards of broken glass. "I practice being her in the mirror. The face must be calm. The eyes must show nothing. If I can disappear inside the role completely, perhaps I will finally stop existing, and that would be a relief." Victor asked me today if I was happy. I said yes. He believed me because he wants to believe. Because if I am unhappy, it means he has failed at something, and he cannot tolerate failure. So I will continue to say yes until the word loses all meaning. Mother wrote, asking when we will have children. I cannot explain to her that I cannot imagine bringing a child into this life, into this apartment where the walls listen and the mirrors judge. How do you mother a child in a country that devours its children? I saw a woman at the market today crying because there were no potatoes. No one comforted her. We all pretended not to see. This is how we survive, by not seeing each other, by not being seen. I am very good at not being seen. The entries continued, dozens of them, spanning what seemed to be years. None mentioned foreign intelligence. None contained operational details. They were simply the private thoughts of a woman slowly suffocating under the weight of a life she had never chosen. On November 20th, Colonel Petrov convened a task force for a status meeting. 12 officers presented their findings. No evidence of foreign recruitment, no suspicious financial activity, no irregular contacts, no clear motive for defection. The surveillance photos near the British embassy remained the only concrete anomaly, and even those were ambiguous. Comrades, Petrov said finally, his voice heavy with frustration, we have investigated for 2 weeks and found nothing except a woman who apparently walked past a foreign embassy several times. Meanwhile, Katia Volkova remains missing, and we have no idea where she went or why. Suggestions? In the silence that followed, Mironov spoke carefully. Comrade Colonel, perhaps we have been asking the wrong questions. We have been investigating a defection, but what if she did not defect? What if she simply left? Left? Left to where? She's a Soviet citizen. She cannot simply leave. Not leave the country. Comrade Colonel, leave her life. Walk away from it. The room fell silent as the implication settled. If Katia had not defected, if she had no foreign handler, if she had not been recruited, then she had vanished for reasons the KGB was fundamentally unprepared to investigate. She had been unhappy, trapped, desperate for escape, and found a way to disappear not because she was a traitor, but because she was human. And if that were true, it meant the perfect Soviet system that promised care and fulfillment to its citizens had failed so completely that a woman would rather vanish into uncertainty than continue living within its embrace. That possibility terrified the men in that room far more than any Western spy ever could. Christmas came to Moscow as it always did, officially ignored, privately observed by those who dared. The investigation into Katia Volkova's disappearance had formally continued for 7 weeks, but by mid-December, resources were being quietly redirected. Victor remained on administrative leave, though the formal charge of security negligence had not been filed. He existed in a liminal state. Not quite accused, not quite cleared, his career suspended like a body in amber. The truth began to emerge not from brilliant detective work, but from bureaucratic accident. On December 18th, a clerk in the Passport Control Directorate was processing routine internal movement reports, documents required whenever Soviet citizens changed their permanent residence within the USSR. Buried in a stack of hundreds of such reports was one that should have been flagged immediately, but had somehow slipped through. A woman named Ekaterina Petrovna Sokolova had registered a change of residence from Moscow to Magadan, in the far northeastern reaches of the Soviet Union, just across the sea from Alaska. The name meant nothing to the clerk initially, but the system included a cross-reference function, and when he entered it into the database, an alarm triggered. Ekaterina Petrovna Sokolova was Katia Volkova's birth name and patronymic. She had used her maiden name and her father's first name to register change. Within 2 hours, Colonel Petrov had the file on his desk. Within 4 hours, he had authorized an immediate investigation team to deploy to Magadan, a 12-hour flight to one of the most remote, inhospitable regions of the Soviet Union, a place still shadowed by its history as a gateway to Stalin's most brutal Gulag camps. Senior investigator Mironov led the team personally. They arrived in Magadan on December 20th, stepping off the Aeroflot flight in the cold that made Moscow seem tropical by comparison. The town sprawled along the coast of the Sea of Okhotsk, its buildings gray and weathered, its streets largely empty in the deep winter. This was where the Kolyma Highway began, the Road of Bones, built by Gulag prisoners, thousands of whom had died in its construction. The address on Katia's residence registration led to a communal apartment building on the outskirts of town, a 5-story concrete block that housed approximately 60 people in conditions that would have been considered poor even by Soviet standards. The building administrator, an ancient woman whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the landscape, checked her records with arthritic fingers. Sokolova, room 34, 4th floor. Shares with 2 other women. Works at the fish processing plant. Quiet. Pays rent on time. Mironov climbed the stairs, his breath forming clouds in the unheated stairwell. Room 34's door was unpainted wood, marked with a number in fading paint. He knocked. The woman who opened the door was unmistakably Katya Volkova. She wore a simple work dress and thick wool stockings. Her hair, no longer carefully styled, was pulled back in a plain bun. Her hands showed the marks of manual labor, redness, small cuts, calluses forming. She looked at Mironov's KGB identification without surprise, without fear, with nothing but a kind of weary resignation. "I wonder when you would come," she said quietly. "Please, come in. We can speak here. My roommates are at work." The room contained 3 narrow beds, a single table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. Personal possessions were minimal. A few clothes hanging on nails on the wall, some books, cooking implements. It was Spartan even by Soviet standards, but it was also, somehow, less oppressive than the comfortable apartment she had shared with Victor in Moscow. Katya sat on one of the beds, folded her hands in her lap with that familiar controlled gesture Mironov had noted in Victor's descriptions. She waited. "Ekaterina Petrovna," Mironov began, using her birth name, "you understand that you have caused significant concern. Your disappearance triggered a major investigation. Your husband has been placed under suspicion. We need to understand what happened and why." "I left," Katya said simply. "I could not continue living that life, so I left." "Why?" "You had a good position, a respectable husband, a comfortable apartment. Many Soviet women would consider such circumstances fortunate." For the first time, something flickered across Katya's face. Not anger, but perhaps something like sad amusement. "Yes, I was very fortunate. I had everything I was supposed to want. But I was dying inside that fortune, comrade investigator. Slowly, quietly, in a way that no one would notice, because no one was actually looking at me." Over the next 3 hours, Katya told her story. Not the story the KGB expected. No foreign recruitment, no ideological betrayal, no dramatic defection. Instead, she described something far more subversive. A woman who had spent her entire life performing a role assigned to her by the state, the party, her family, and her husband, until she no longer knew if any authentic self remained beneath the performance. "I was 6 when my father died," she explained, her voice steady but soft. "My mother told me that I had to be strong, that I carried his legacy, that I must honor his sacrifice by being a perfect Soviet citizen. So I learned to be perfect. I studied hard, joined the right organizations, said the right things. I made myself invisible because being noticed meant being vulnerable to criticism, and criticism meant failure, and failure meant dishonoring my father's memory." She had married Victor because it was expected, because her mother had been anxious about her remaining single at 23, because Victor represented stability and respectability. She had never loved him. She barely knew what love meant, had never been permitted to explore such feelings. Love was bourgeois sentimentality. Love was a distraction from duty. "The marriage was tolerable at first," she continued, staring at her work-worn hands. "Victor didn't demand much. Meals at regular times. Clean apartment. Correct behavior. He didn't notice that I had no friends because he didn't have friends either. He didn't notice that I never laughed because he never expected laughter. We existed in parallel. 2 people sharing space but never actually touching, not in any way that mattered. The breaking point," she explained, "came not from any single event but from accumulation. Years of small erasures, tiny deaths of possibility. The wives' committee meetings where women competed to demonstrate their husband's importance. The apartment inspections where even the books you own could raise suspicion. The constant performance of contentment in a system that offered everything except the freedom to choose your own path. When Victor received his promotion, Katya said, I realized that my life was set. Nothing would change. I would grow old in that apartment, translating meaningless documents, attending meaningless meetings, sleeping beside a man who knew nothing about me and had never asked. And one day I would die, and the only mark I would leave would be a brief notation in some file. Loyal citizen, acceptable wife, properly deceased. The walks past the British Embassy, the surveillance photos that seemed so damning, had been exactly what they appeared. Walks. Katia had discovered that neighborhood by accident, while taking longer and longer routes home from work, postponing her return to the apartment. The presence of foreign embassies, the glimpses of diplomats from other countries, the abstract possibility of a different life had drawn her there repeatedly. I wasn't planning to defect, she insisted. I wasn't brave enough for that. And besides, I didn't want to trade one prison for another. I didn't want to live in America or Britain as a celebrated defector, paraded around as propaganda. I just wanted to disappear, to find a place where no one knew me, where I had no obligations, where I could discover there was anything real beneath all the performances. The plan had formed gradually. She had researched internal passport procedures, learned about regions where bureaucracy was lax and oversight minimal. Magadan had appealed precisely because it was so remote, so harsh, so far removed from Moscow scrutiny. It was a place people went to escape. Prisoners released from camps who had no permission to return west, dissidents sent into internal exile, those who had failed in the center and sought anonymity on the periphery. On November 5th, while Victor slept, Katia had packed her documents and the small amount of money she had saved from her salary over years. She had left everything else, the clothes, the books, the life. At 4:30, she had walked out of the building, taken the metro to Sheremetyevo Airport, and used her savings to purchase a ticket to Magadan, claiming she was visiting a sick relative for employment verification. The clerk had barely looked at her. Wasn't anyone suspicious? Mironov asked. Didn't anyone question a woman traveling alone to Magadan? Comrade investigator, Katia said with that sad half-smile, I have spent my entire life being the kind of woman no one notices. I dress plainly. I speak quietly. I lower my eyes. I am exactly the type of person bureaucrats process without seeing. I am invisible, and I use that invisibility to escape. In Magadan, she had registered under her maiden name, found work at the fish processing plant brutal, cold, exhausting labor that required no explanations or background checks, and rented space in the communal apartment. For 6 weeks, she had lived in this harsh place, working 12-hour shifts, sleeping on a narrow bed, eating simple food. And are you happy? Mironov asked, the question feeling absurd even as he spoke it. Katia considered carefully. I don't know if I'm happy, but I am real. The cold here is real. The work is real. The pain in my hands at night is real. I speak to my roommates about simple things. The weather, the fish quality, how to make boots last through winter. No one asks me to perform loyalty or contentment. No one monitors my thoughts. For the first time in my life, I am allowed to simply be without justification. That may not be happiness, but it is something I never had before. Mironov sat in silence, his training and ideology warring with something unexpected, a kind of uncomfortable comprehension. He had spent his career hunting traitors and dissidents, people who threatened the Soviet state through action or ideology. But Katia threatened the state through her very existence, through the question her disappearance posed. What if the system that promised care for all its citizens was actually suffocating them, so completely that some would rather freeze in Magadan than continue pretending to be content? You understand, he said finally, that you cannot simply abandon your responsibilities. You are married. You have a position. Your husband's career has been damaged by your actions. I understand, Katia replied, but I also understand that I have only one life, and I cannot spend it as a ghost in someone else's story. You can arrest me if you wish. You can send me back to Moscow, force me to return to Victor, but I will not pretend anymore. If that makes me a traitor, then I am a traitor to a life that was killing me slowly. Mironov returned to Moscow on December 23rd with a report that would never be filed officially, that would circulate only among a handful of senior officers who needed to understand what had happened. The report concluded that Katia Volkova had not defected, had no foreign intelligence connections, and posed no security threat. She had simply left an unhappy marriage to start over in internal exile. The recommendation was carefully worded. No charges should be filed, as prosecution would require publicly acknowledging that a KGB officer's wife had been so dissatisfied with Soviet life that she fled to one of the harshest regions of the country. Better to quietly annul the marriage, transfer Victor to a less sensitive position, and close the file with a notation of personal matters resolved without security implications. On January 12, 1979, Viktor Volkov was officially reassigned to the Archives Department, a career death sentence disguised as a lateral move. He accepted without protest, understanding that he had been permitted to survive professionally only by the grace of an organization that preferred to bury embarrassing truths. Katia remained in Magadan. The KGB maintained passive surveillance, but she never contacted foreign intelligence, never engaged in dissident activities, never did anything except work, live, and exist in that cold, remote place where she had finally found something resembling freedom. Years later, after the Soviet Union collapsed and the KGB's files were partially opened, a researcher would discover the Volkov case buried in the archives. The researcher would write a small article about it, noting that it represented a type of resistance rarely acknowledged, not political defiance, not ideological opposition, but simply the quiet refusal to continue performing a role that erased the self. The article would quote from Katia's notebook, those fragments of thought that revealed a woman disappearing inside the life assigned to her. And it would end with a question that the KGB had never been able to answer. How many other loyal Soviet wives, husbands, workers, and citizens had wanted to vanish but lacked the courage or the means? How many had spent their lives as ghosts, present but not truly there, performing contentment while dying inside? In Magadan, Katia would eventually remarry, a widowed fisherman who asked nothing of her except honesty. She would never return to Moscow. She would never speak publicly about her past. But on winter evenings, standing at a window of her small apartment and watching the snow fall over the Sea of Okhotsk, she would sometimes smile, a real smile, not performed for anyone, just a quiet acknowledgement that she had survived, that she had chosen herself. And that choice had been worth everything it cost. The perfect Soviet wife had vanished, but the real woman had finally appeared.